There's a quiet question that many people carry, but rarely say out loud. Where did God go? Not the God of churches or temples, but the one you used to feel in moments of stillness, the presence that made the world feel alive, that made pain seem bearable, that whispered, "There's more than this." At some point, that presence disappeared, not with a scream, but with a slow fading, like a light that doesn't realize it's dying. And now you're left with the echo of that absence. You still look for meaning, still reach for something beyond yourself, but it's harder to find. The world feels louder, colder, more mechanical. You scroll through miracles and tragedies in the same feed and feel nothing. You go to work, pay bills, laugh at small things, but something essential has gone missing. It's not that you stopped believing. It's that belief stopped feeling real. That's the silent crisis of our time. Not the death of God, but the disappearance of the felt sacred. Carl Jung saw this happening decades ago. He called it the withdrawal of projections. For centuries, humans projected the divine outward, onto gods, heavens, saviors. But as consciousness evolved, those projections began to collapse. The gods didn't die. We took them back into ourselves. Jung wrote, "Man's relation to God was never destroyed. It was transformed into the psychic process of individuation." In other words, when the outer image of God fades, the search moves inward. So maybe the question isn't, where did God go? But where did we stop looking? Imagine this. For most of human history, the divine was a mirror we hung in the sky. We looked upward to see what we could become. We worshipped what we feared, and through that fear, we learned humility. But as science advanced, that mirror cracked. We realized the universe doesn't revolve around us. We saw how fragile and small we are, and instead of awe, we felt isolation. The outer God, the one who ruled from beyond, lost power, but the inner image, the symbol of wholeness, began to awaken. That's where Jung stood, apart from both believers and atheists. He didn't argue for God's existence. He studied the experience of God, the way the psyche creates a living symbol to express the infinite. He said the word God refers not to an external being, but to the totality of the psyche, what he called the self. And when we lose contact with that center, life becomes hollow, soulless, disenchanted. Jung once described the modern man as spiritually homeless. We live surrounded by more knowledge than any generation before us, and yet more of us feel lost than ever. He wrote, "The gods have become diseases." By that he meant, when the divine is no longer experienced as something sacred, it returns as psychological symptoms. Anxiety replaces prayer. Addiction replaces ritual. Ambition becomes a new religion. We try to fill the absence with noise, but the psyche knows what's missing. It still longs for a living relationship with something greater. Not authority, not doctrine. Something sacred. Something that moves the soul. That longing is why we search for God inside ourselves. It's not vanity. It's evolution. Jung's own story proves it. In the Red Book, he describes how, after separating from Freud, his entire worldview collapsed. He felt abandoned by God, haunted by visions, trapped in the abyss of his own mind. He wrote that he fell into the depths. For years, he wrestled with images, serpents, prophets, gods, and voices. He feared he was going mad. But out of that chaos emerged something extraordinary. He realized that the divine he had sought in theology was alive in the unconscious. The gods he saw were not hallucinations. They were psychic realities, archetypal forces that had shaped humanity since time began. That realization became the heart of Jungian psychology. He wrote, "To find the God image, one must turn inward to the source of all religious experience. It's not belief that reconnects us. It's relationship. Not worship from afar, but participation in the mystery within. Think about what happens when you pray. Not to a deity, but in despair. You're not talking to the sky. You're speaking to the deepest part of yourself, the part that listens even when you've stopped believing. That listening presence, that awareness that watches your thoughts, isn't the ego. It's the self." Jung saw that every genuine religious experience is an encounter between the ego and the self. It's not about kneeling before an image of God, but recognizing the divine as a living pattern within the psyche. That's why every culture, across time, created gods that mirrored human qualities. The gods were never separate from us. They were our own depths, projected outward. When we loved, we created deities of beauty and desire. When we feared, we created gods of chaos and death. When we longed for order, we imagined lawgivers in the sky. And when we matured, those gods turned back toward us, asking to be integrated, not worshipped. But here's the challenge. To find God within, you must face everything that hides there. Your shadow, your rage, your envy, your wounds. Because the divine is not only light, it's wholeness. And wholeness includes what we reject. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So, if you've lost your faith, if the idea of God feels dead, it may be because your image of God was too small. The psyche doesn't want you to believe in an image. It wants you to experience the living mystery behind it. And that mystery can only be met through suffering, through silence, through surrender. It often begins when the old meaning collapses. A crisis, a heartbreak, a loss that strips you bare. You start asking questions you used to avoid. You stop pretending certainty is strength. And in that vulnerability, something sacred stirs again. Not as comfort, but as presence. As an awareness that doesn't promise answers, but whispers, "You are not separate from what you seek." That's the turning point, when God stops being a word and becomes a relationship. Many people today feel that religion has failed them. They turn to therapy, philosophy, or spirituality trying to fill the same hole. But beneath all of those paths is the same hunger, the longing to encounter meaning that transcends the self. That's why Jung believed psychology had become the new form of religion, not because it worships the mind, but because it offers a language to speak to the soul again. The unconscious became the new sacred space. Dreams became modern scriptures. Symbols became living prayers. He wrote, "The religious function of the psyche is autonomous. It exists whether you believe in it or not." That's the paradox. Even if you reject God, your psyche still creates a version of the divine, because the search for totality, for wholeness, is built into human nature. You can't escape it. You can only redefine it. So what does it mean to find God within? It doesn't mean inflating the ego, declaring yourself divine. It means realizing that the divine moves through you. That consciousness itself is the meeting point between the finite and the infinite. When you begin to live from that awareness, the world changes texture. You stop seeing only objects and start seeing symbols. A sunrise isn't just light, it's renewal. A conversation isn't just words, it's communion. Even suffering becomes a form of initiation. The sacred returns quietly through perception. That's the real answer to where did God go? God didn't vanish. We outgrew the image we had of God. And now we're being asked to rediscover the divine not above us, but within us. This search isn't about religion or disbelief. It's about wholeness. It's about remembering that the same light you used to worship in the sky is also flickering behind your eyes. The world hasn't lost God. It's rediscovering Him in human form. And that's why the search never ends. Because what we call God is simply the mirror of our own awakening. After you realize that what you once called God now lives inside you, the world doesn't immediately become peaceful. It becomes heavier. You start to sense meaning in everything, and that sensitivity is both a gift and a burden. You can't look away anymore. You can't lie to yourself the same way. You can't treat small things as unimportant. Awareness costs energy, and the more awake you become, the more life demands your honesty. Jung warned about this. He said that when consciousness expands too quickly, it risks burning itself out. The ego tries to grasp the divine and call it mine. That's the moment awareness turns into inflation. You see it in people who discover spirituality and suddenly speak with the voice of a prophet. You see it in those who use enlightenment as an identity. They forget that seeing deeply doesn't make you superior. It only makes you more responsible. The deeper you go into the self, the humbler you must become. Because the divine you find there isn't your possession. It's not a personal trophy. It's a force moving through you, indifferent to status, unimpressed by ego. Jung said the danger of the God image is that it blinds those who stare too long. We can't hold pure light without creating shadow. So, if you want to carry divine awareness, you must learn to bow to it, not own it. The real spiritual path doesn't make you radiant, it makes you real. It strips you bare of illusion until you realize that holiness was never perfection, it was wholeness. And wholeness means contradiction, failure, and surrender. To search for God within yourself is to accept that you are not purely good, not purely wise, not purely anything. You are a mixture of heaven and earth, of longing and fear, of creation and destruction. And if you can hold all of that without running, you begin to live as consciousness itself. That's what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The light of awareness is born from what you are willing to face, not from what you pretend to be. The simplest test of whether you're moving toward the divine or away from it is how you treat the ordinary. Do you still see life as sacred when no one's watching? Do you still care about what's small and fleeting? Can you be kind without needing to feel important? If awareness doesn't make you more human, it isn't awareness. It's just performance. Real spirituality hides itself in plain sight, in how you eat, how you listen, how you breathe, when someone else is speaking. When you remember that every act participates in the whole, you stop dividing your life into sacred and profane. You start realizing that everything counts. Jung said that when the gods left the heavens, they entered the unconscious. That means that every conflict you have inside, every tension, every desire, every fear, is also a divine drama replaying itself through you. You're not just living your life, you're living a myth. The question is whether you recognize it. The person who denies the sacred within is doomed to repeat it unconsciously. The person who sees it consciously begins to transform it. That's the quiet miracle of individuation. Not becoming divine, but becoming transparent enough for divinity to move through you. Still, awareness alone isn't enough. You can't live permanently open. To see everything is to risk losing stability. Even Jung warned that when the unconscious floods the mind, the psyche becomes unmoored. That's why grounding matters. You must keep one foot in the human world. Eat, work, touch, move, ritualize your return to the body. Light candles not for worship, but for orientation. Write down what you feel before it dissolves into abstraction. Take walks without trying to decode every symbol that crosses your path. Ritual isn't superstition, it's rhythm. It gives shape to what's infinite. Without rhythm, even truth becomes overwhelming. With it, awareness becomes a pulse, expanding, contracting, resting, returning. There's a quiet danger in the life of introspection, the temptation to interpret everything. You begin to see signs in every coincidence, messages in every dream. You start reading the universe like a personal novel, and after a while, it becomes exhausting. That's how mysticism turns into neurosis. When everything is sacred, nothing feels real. To avoid that trap, you need silence. Not analysis, but pause. You learn to let some mysteries remain unnamed. You allow the psyche to breathe. Jung said that the unconscious works best when not disturbed by constant interference. Your task is not to control it, but to stay in dialogue with it. Patiently, respectfully, like two minds learning to trust each other again. There will be moments when it all feels absurd. You'll wonder if you made it all up. The symbols, the synchronicities, the sense of meaning. You'll think you're back where you started, but that's part of the rhythm. The psyche moves in circles, not lines. Meaning comes and goes like a tide. When it recedes, don't panic. Don't try to drag it back. Just stay open. It always returns. This humility, the willingness to not know, is the truest form of faith. It's not faith in a doctrine, but faith in the process of life itself. As the inner search deepens, you begin to see that the sacred never left the world. It was only hidden behind perception. You catch glimpses of it everywhere. In the stranger who looks at you with quiet understanding, in the sound of rain on a window, in the ache that reminds you that you're still alive. These aren't coincidences. They're reminders. Tiny echoes of the infinite. Jung called them synchronicities, moments when the inner and outer worlds briefly align. They don't prove anything. They simply show that consciousness and reality are woven from the same fabric. When you start noticing these moments, you stop feeling alone. The world begins to speak again, and you realize that God never vanished. He just started using a subtler language. In time, the obsession with searching fades. You stop looking for God like an answer and start feeling Him as atmosphere. You live slower. You speak more carefully. You react less. You stop needing proof, because awareness itself becomes proof enough. Everything you meet reflects something in you, and everything in you reflects something larger. That's what it means to live with God inside, not to control, not to escape, but to participate. You become a bridge between what's visible and what's unseen. The world won't understand this easily. It moves too fast for silence, too loudly for awe. But you'll notice that the more you honor the inner life, the less you need approval. You start trading recognition for peace. You stop performing enlightenment. You start practicing presence. And that's where the sacred becomes ordinary again. Not above life, but through it. The cup of coffee, the late walk, the simple act of breathing, they all shimmer quietly with meaning. That's what the mystics meant by seeing God in all things. Not a fantasy, but a shift in perception. When the soul becomes clear, the world becomes luminous. This is the real integration Jung wrote about. To find the divine within and still keep your feet on the ground. To carry light without pretending to be the light. To live truthfully without needing to announce it. The closer you come to the self, the simpler life becomes. Not easier, but clearer. You begin to act from alignment, not from fear. You stop chasing transcendence and start embodying it. And that's when the question changes. You no longer ask, "Where did God go?" You ask, "How do I live knowing He never left?" When the storm inside you begins to quiet, the search doesn't end. It simply changes shape. You stop reaching outward for revelation and start learning how to live from the center you've uncovered. The question is no longer, "Where is God?" It becomes, "How do I move through life without losing that stillness?" You begin to notice that awareness doesn't need grand experiences to stay alive. It survives in small gestures, remembering to breathe before you speak, feeling gratitude before you know why, allowing silence to finish a conversation. These aren't spiritual techniques. They're ways of remaining in dialogue with what is sacred. Everyday life becomes the field where the divine hides. Cooking, walking, answering a message. Each moment can either numb or awaken you. The difference is attention. To be present is to pray without words. To act sincerely is to build an altar wherever you stand. Jung once wrote that the purpose of life is to make the unconscious conscious. But consciousness isn't just insight, it's participation. You don't illuminate the soul by thinking about it. You illuminate it by living with awareness of what you're doing. There will be times when that awareness feels heavy again. You'll wake up and feel the old distance return, as if the world has gone dull, as if nothing has meaning. But now you know this pattern. You've watched it come and go before. The light doesn't vanish. It recedes so that you can grow eyes to see it again. Meaning breathes. It contracts and expands. When you forget this, you start to panic. When you remember, you begin to trust the rhythm of being human. That trust becomes your real faith. Not belief in a doctrine, but confidence that life itself is intelligent, that consciousness, even when dark, is moving somewhere. You stop measuring spirituality by how happy you feel. You start measuring it by how honestly you live. Some days, the most sacred thing you can do is simply not turn away. To live with God inside yourself doesn't mean you'll never feel lost again. It means you can feel lost without despairing. You carry an inner orientation that no external chaos can fully erase. Even in confusion, something in you remains aware. That awareness is the quiet trace of the divine. Sometimes it appears as intuition, a gentle pull toward what feels right, even when logic disagrees. Sometimes it comes as a dream that repeats until you finally listen. Sometimes it's the sudden calm in the middle of fear. You don't control these things. You respond to them. The more you respect them, the clearer they become. Jung said that the self communicates through symbols because symbols hold opposites together. They let the rational and the irrational coexist. When you see a symbol in a dream or a coincidence, don't rush to define it. Let it speak in its own language. Understanding comes later. Presence comes first. As this way of seeing matures, something surprising happens. You start to forgive reality for being imperfect. You forgive people for being contradictory. You forgive yourself for being human. The urge to divide everything into sacred and profane, pure and impure, right and wrong, begins to fade. In its place grows compassion, not sentimental, but grounded. Compassion is what divine sight looks like when it enters the world. It doesn't excuse harm, but it understands that ignorance is part of the human condition. It sees the shadow without hatred. That's how the inner God keeps the world from tearing itself apart. When Jung wrote about individuation, he compared it to alchemy. Base metal becomes gold not by escaping fire, but by enduring it. The same is true for the soul. Every crisis that strips you of certainty is fire. Every heartbreak, every failure, every loss, they're not punishments. They're purification. The ego resists, but the self watches patiently, knowing that only through disintegration can integration occur. At a certain point, you realize you're no longer chasing transformation. You're participating in it. Life itself becomes the alchemical vessel, and consciousness the flame that keeps refining you. Sometimes people ask what it means to serve the divine once they've found it inside. It means to keep doing what you were already doing, but with attention. To speak truthfully, even when no one notices. To create beauty, even when no one praises it. To meet pain, without turning it into performance. To live as if every small act matters, because it does. This isn't romantic. It's discipline. Awareness is a practice, not a mood. It requires returning again and again to the center, especially when the world tries to pull you back into distraction. Each return strengthens the connection. Each fall teaches humility. That's how divinity becomes stable inside you. Not through miracles, but through repetition. Eventually, you understand why Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Because when you become yourself fully, you become a unique expression of the same consciousness that created everything. You don't have to seek God. You become a place where God experiences the world. And when you look at others, you start to recognize the same spark behind their eyes. even those who have forgotten, even those still lost in noise, the same presence is waiting there. You stop trying to convince anyone of anything. You just live quietly as proof that it's possible to be both human and whole. There's a peace that follows this understanding. Not joy exactly, but steadiness. You don't wake up in awe every morning. You wake up available. You move through the day with a kind of inner gravity. You stop asking, "What should I do with my life?" and start asking, "How can I be alive right now?" That question turns every moment into prayer. It turns uncertainty into intimacy. It turns the ordinary into revelation. When the mind falls silent for even a second, you feel it again. The same quiet presence you once thought was gone. It's been here the whole time, watching through your eyes, breathing through your lungs, waiting for you to remember. So where did God go? Nowhere. He went where he's always been, into the only place vast enough to hold him, the human soul. And every time you listen deeply, every time you choose truth over comfort, every time you let compassion rise instead of fear, you make that presence visible again. Maybe that's the real purpose of consciousness, not to find God, but to let him see himself through us.